That field isn't yours anymore. Leave before we call the police. Component placement, shouted the project manager, pushing the elderly farmer away from the land he had cultivated for 40 years. Passers-by only watched in silence, but exactly 24 hours later, more than 100 veterans from across the state had arrived, standing in formation before that very same field, a brotherhood forged in battle now united once more. Type unfair if you believe this action is unacceptable. Welcome to QH. Let's uncover what really happened. Marshall Reed, 67, wasn't just any farmer. After serving his country with distinction through 2 tours in Kuwait, he had returned to the only life he knew, working the land his father had left him. For decades his calloused hands had coaxed corn, squash and beans from the soil, feeding not just himself but sharing with the entire community. His farm stand had become legendary in 3 counties for its honor system. Take what you need, pay what you can. The morning sun had barely risen when the development team arrived at his gate. Their expensive SUVs looked out of place against the weathered fence posts and humble farmhouse where American flags had flown continuously since 1975. Men in expensive suits carried clipboards and surveys, their polished shoes quickly muddied in the morning dew. "Mr. Reed," the project manager announced, not bothering to remove his sunglasses, "this land has been redesignated by the local authority for commercial development. The compensation package was mailed to you 3 months ago. We need you to vacate immediately to maintain our construction schedule." Marshall stood stunned, grip tightening on his worn leather work gloves. "I never signed anything. I never agreed to sell. This farm is all I have. Where would I even go?" The manager's voice turned cold. "Whether it's legal or not is a matter for the courts, but you need to vacate the premises today. The county has already approved the permits. Progress can't wait for sentimentality." When Marshall refused to move, the crew began dismantling his fence. Posts that had stood for generations were yanked from the ground. Workers trampled newly sprouted seedlings, plants Marshall had carefully tended since the first spring thaw, heirloom varieties passed down through his family for generations. One worker even shoved Marshall, causing him to stumble backward. "Just retire already, old man. Your generation's time is over. Nobody farms like this anymore anyway." People from nearby homes gathered at the commotion, some filmed with their phones, but no one stepped forward. No one spoke up. One woman looked away guiltily when Marshall caught her eye. She'd been receiving free vegetables from him for years when times were tough. As the morning wore on, Marshall's resistance weakened. The legal papers they thrust at him contained terminology he couldn't fully understand, with signatures he didn't recognize. By noon, the bulldozers had already begun clearing the northern edge of his property, uprooting an apple orchard his grandfather had planted. The sunset found Marshall sitting alone on a broken fence post. His weathered hands clutched a fistful of damp soil, earth he had tended for 4 decades. His face was streaked with dirt, but not tears. Veterans don't cry, he'd been taught, even when their world crumbles around them. As twilight descended, a local news van pulled away, having captured enough footage for a brief human interest segment. The reporter had asked superficial questions, more interested in the shopping complex coming than in the man losing his heritage. Marshall watched them leave, then looked down at the soil in his palm. This land wasn't just property, it was the only home he'd known since returning from war, the only place he'd felt at peace after the nightmares that still haunted him. By the next morning, video clips of the elderly farmer evicted from his land had spread online, but the story had been edited and manipulated to portray Marshall as a confused old man standing in the way of jobs and economic growth. Local media described it as an elderly farmer overreacting to an approved development project that will bring 300 jobs to our struggling community. One popular talk show host commented, "It's sad, but we can't let emotion stand in the way of economic progress. Sometimes the old must make way for the new. That's just life." People Marshall had considered friends for decades avoided his calls. A neighbor who had enjoyed Marshall's vegetables for years simply said, "It's a shame, but what can you do? Times change. Besides, a new shopping center would be convenient. I'm tired of driving 30 minutes to buy decent clothes." The local diner where Marshall had eaten breakfast every Sunday for 40 years suddenly had no seats available. The waitress who'd served him for 20 years couldn't meet his eyes as the manager asked him to leave. "We're just too busy today, Marshall. Maybe try again tomorrow." Marshall refused to surrender without a fight. He drove his old pickup to the county clerk's office, filing a formal complaint. The clerk barely looked up from her computer as he approached the counter. "The paperwork has been finalized," she said flatly. "There's no legal basis for your objection. The county board unanimously approved the rezoning 6 months ago, but I never received any notice." Marshall insisted, voice rising, "That land has been in my family for 3 generations. I was never even given a chance to speak at the hearing." "Sir, please lower your voice," the clerk responded. "The notification was legally published in the county bulletin. It's not our fault you didn't read it. Security will escort you out if you can't behave appropriately." Marshall's shoulders slumped as he left the government building. The system he had fought to protect abroad now seemed to have no place for him. The flag pin on his jacket, once worn with pride, now felt like a cruel joke. That evening, Marshall sat alone in his garage. He pulled out an old wooden box containing his military medals, battle maps and photographs of comrades long gone. With trembling hands, he removed the American flag that had hung proudly outside his home since his return from service. Through the window he could see his field, now marked with surveyor stakes and orange construction tape. Absently he twisted the wedding ring he still wore, though his wife had passed years ago. Eleanor would have known what to do. She always found the right words when he could. His mind drifted to memories of combat, brothers in arms falling beside him, their last thoughts always of home, of American soil, the very soil being stripped from him now. In the distance, construction lights had been set up for overnight work. The developers weren't wasting any time. By morning there would be nothing left of his cornfield. Marshall placed his bronze star back in the box. No one remembered what it stood for anymore. No one remembered what any of it had cost. The citation read, "For valor under extreme duress." But where was valor in today's world? Where was honor? No one stood by his side. No one remembered he once risked his life for this country. If you think this is deeply unjust, type HONOR. The following day, a rumbling sound echoed from the distance, the unmistakable growl of military transport vehicles and the rhythmic thud of boots hitting pavement in unison. The sound grew louder until it was impossible to ignore, even for the construction workers who had arrived at dawn to continue the demolition. Marshall stepped onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, unable to believe his eyes. Stretching along the entire perimeter of his property stood hundreds of men and women in faded military uniforms. They carried no weapons, but something more powerful, a massive banner reading, "This land was earned, not bought." Veterans from every branch of service, spanning conflicts from Kuwait to Afghanistan, stood shoulder to shoulder. Leading them was retired Colonel David Monroe, his chest decorated with medals that caught the morning sunlight. Once the commanding officer of Marshall's battalion in Kuwait, the colonel walked with a slight limp, a permanent reminder of a battle where Marshall had pulled him to safety. The colonel approached Marshall, saluting crisply. "We're not here to protest, Collins," he announced, voice carrying across the suddenly quiet field. "We're here to remember. This man saved our lives, and America doesn't abandon its hero." Construction workers paused, machines falling silent as media crews rushed to capture the unexpected development. Phones recorded everything as veterans formed a human chain around the property line. A veteran with silver hair stepped forward, unfolding a tactical map with Marshall's name clearly marked, detailing his crucial support role during the 1968 Tet Offensive, where he had maintained radio contact despite being wounded twice. Another veteran opened his shirt, revealing a jagged scar across his chest. "Marshall carried me 8 kilometers back to base after our transport was hit. If not for him, I wouldn't be standing here today. I wouldn't have met my wife. My children wouldn't exist." One by one, they shared stories, moments of bravery, sacrifice and quiet heroism that Marshall had never spoken of, not even to his closest neighbors. Stories of a young soldier who repeatedly risked everything for his brothers in arms, asking nothing in return. National news networks began broadcasting live. Social media feeds flooded with images of veterans standing shoulder to shoulder, a living wall of solidarity. Hashtags demanding justice spread across platforms, and within hours, the governor's office issued a statement promising to look into the situation immediately. Local residents, seeing the gathering on television, began arriving with food, water and their own American flag. Children asked for autographs from the veterans. Elderly neighbors who had watched from windows the day before now stood proudly alongside the veterans, some bringing old photographs of Marshall from community events, harvest festivals and charity drives he had quietly organized for decades. A young attorney stepped forward, the son of a soldier Marshall had saved. "I'll represent you pro bono, sir. What they're doing isn't just morally wrong, I believe it's legally questionable too. The notification process was deliberately obscure. We'll fight this all the way to the state Supreme Court if necessary." By mid-afternoon, the development company issued a hasty statement. "In light of community concerns, we are temporarily suspending operations to reassess the project's impact. We respect the service of veterans and seek a resolution that honors their contributions." As the sun began to set, Marshall found himself in the center of a circle formed by his former comrades. They stood at attention, saluting him with the same respect given to their highest commander. Colonel Monroe stepped forward, and together with Marshall, they raised the American flag once more, planting it firmly in the mound of earth the bulldozers had left behind. The fading light caught the tears on the faces of hardened soldiers who had sworn never to cry again. And for the first time in decades, Marshall Reed wept openly, without shame. 1 week later, Marshall's property was temporarily designated as a Veterans Memorial Community Space, while legal proceedings continued. What began as a simple act of solidarity had transformed into something far more significant, a nationwide conversation about the value we place on those who serve, and the true meaning of community. Children from the neighborhood came to learn gardening from Marshall. The rows of corn and vegetables that had been trampled were replanted, not just by Marshall, but by dozens of helping hands. Local businesses donated seeds, tools, and irrigation equipment. A contractor offered to rebuild the damaged sections of the farmhouse free of charge. A young girl looked up at him while pressing a seed into the soil. "Mr. Marshall, is this land really yours now?" she asked, her small fingers carefully covering the seed with earth. Marshall smiled gently. "No, sweetheart, it belongs to those who are brave enough to stand up for what's right. It belongs to people like you, who will grow things long after I'm gone." A woman brought flowers to the edge of the field, the widow of a soldier who never made it home, a man Marshall had tried to save during their final mission together. "He always said you were the bravest of them all," she told Marshall, her voice breaking, "because you fought not just during the war, but every day after. You lived the life they couldn't have, connected to the land, growing things, making peace with what happened." National media wrote, "The silent veteran who made a system listen." Editorials debated not just Marshall's case, but hundreds of similar situations across the country where development had displaced vulnerable communities. Investigative journalists uncovered that the development company had used similar tactics in 7 other communities, specifically targeting elderly property owners with confusing notices and compressed timelines. The county board members who had approved the project faced uncomfortable questions at a special town hall meeting broadcast live nationwide. "How could you not personally notify a decorated veteran before taking his land?" demanded a young mother holding up a picture of her own father in uniform. "Is this how we thank those who serve?" The development company, facing unprecedented public scrutiny and boycotts of their other properties, announced a complete redesign of their project, one that would preserve Marshall's farm as a working educational center, surrounded by smaller, locally owned businesses. "We've listened to the community," their CEO stated, though few believed the change of heart was genuine. 3 months later, a formal ceremony was held on the contested field. The American flag that had once hung unnoticed outside Marshall's modest home was carefully folded with military precision, then presented back to him by the very comrades he had saved decades earlier, now gray-haired, but standing tall. As Marshall accepted the flag, Colonel Monroe addressed the gathered crowd. "America isn't just a place on a map, it's a promise that those who sacrificed for her will never be forgotten or discarded. Today we kept that promise, not just to Marshall, but to ourselves." Marshall's story echoed far beyond his small town. Veterans groups across the nation began establishing community gardens on vacant lots. Legal aid clinics specializing in land rights for veterans opened in 5 states. A bipartisan bill, requiring special notification procedures for veterans facing property disputes, gained unexpected traction in Congress. And Marshall? He continued farming, though now rarely alone. Every Saturday, volunteers joined him, learning skills many feared had been lost to time. He established a program teaching sustainable agriculture to returning veterans, finding that working the soil had healing properties for those still carrying invisible wounds of war. That night, under a moonlit sky, Marshall sat with dirt beneath his nails and veterans at his side. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. He felt rooted, not just in land, but in love, memory, and unity. The field they tried to pave over had bloomed into something far stronger, a living legacy, built by hands that had once held rifles and now held trowels, seeds, and second chances. "Not everyone who loses their land loses everything," a national magazine wrote in their profile of Marshall. "A man willing to sit alone amid ruins, but still stand for what's right, preserves honor for an entire generation." Some battles are fought with weapons, others are fought with courage, community, and an unwavering belief that justice matters. The final image, a sea of American flags planted in freshly tilled soil, ready for spring planting, became iconic, a symbol of resistance, remembrance, and renewal. You may forget this story in a few days, but if no one tells it, history will remain silent forever. Subscribe to QH Incredible Stories, where justice, kindness, and memory are protected to the end.